All right, welcome back to DTR's YouTube channel. I'd like to start the video out by saying thanks to all who have subscribed and participated in any way on any of the videos that I've already produced. I appreciate it, and let's keep this channel going. Thanks. So today, in this video, we're going to look at something that in the restoration world or the car world, some people always have sour grapes about or have certain negative feelings about, and that is bodywork and body filler. And I want to debunk some of the myths that go into body filler. On any of these panels in here today that I've worked on, the body filler is used exactly for what it's supposed to be used for. It's not used for fixing rust holes. It's not used for creating excessive build of body lines or what have you. It's basically a very thin coat across a panel that has very gentle waves in it. One of the things that I've always come across is people see a panel I have completely skim coated in filler, and they look at that as being wrong. Well, the filler and or sanding primer is essentially the same thing, except it's a different ratio of resin to talc, or the thickening agent, you could say. So laying the filler down, you can lay down a much heavier layer at one time, but at the end of the day, you're going to end up with a pretty thin film of essentially what's made up of resin and talc, which would be the same thing as if you put 100 coats of sanding primer down. You don't want to use a lot of sanding primer at once because as the chemicals come out of it, it will shrink, and after the car is painted, you're going to start to see exactly where you did all your body work. You're going to see all your sanding scratches because all the primer is going to sink into those. So you want to do kind of like each step to a minimum. We got these panels all done. It took for the two fenders and the two doors for the 69 Caprice, it took about 3 days or so. I also have my rear valance and another tiny little filler panel that goes across the back window. Those were pretty much gravy to do. So I got all those done. What I have left to do and what we're going to focus on in this video is the correct way of doing body filler. I've seen some videos out there and I've seen a lot of methods that just are completely backwards, and they're not wrong, but there's a lot of things that I can show you that if you want to try doing body filler work on your own car, I'm going to get you a little bit more educated and teach you better, cleaner ways of doing it and safer ways of doing it. And what we're going to concentrate on is I have the tops of these fenders left to block and do my body work on. So I'm just going to show you some methods on getting your panels to this stage, to the point of putting a first layer coat of sanding primer on. So let's get started and learn something today. So we got our fenders set up on the stand, and they're in primer. All these parts, the doors, the fenders, all these parts that I've done the body work on. Since this project started, if you've been following along, there was an issue with the type of epoxy that was put on these panels. So these panels were sent out to be sandblasted. I then got them back. I sanded the metal surfaces as best I could with 180 sandpaper. Then they were washed. I use a solvent sprayer and I wash all the panels, blow them off really good, get all the debris out. Then they get one coat of epoxy primer, which you can put just epoxy primer on bare metal and then do your body work right over the top of that. Depending on the epoxy you're using, and in most cases, I don't like the way most epoxies sand. So, plus it doesn't give a lot of millage. I mean, you do one or two cuts and you're through it. So the point of the epoxy to begin with is for the corrosion protection. So that's why after the epoxy is put on, I wait usually about an hour or so. I usually turn the heat on in the booth, and then I'll apply about usually minimum 2 coats of sanding primer, because after the sanding primer is on, you get a little bit more millage to work with. In some cases, you may put the epoxy on, put the sanding primer on, block and sand everything out, and it may not need any body work. But the sanding primer is something that's a lot easier to sand. I like doing my body work over a couple layers of this rather than right over the epoxy. Plus, after I put the sanding primer down, I do tint a little bit of sanding primer, and I come back and I spray a guide coat, which is this blue color. So I have a place to start when I start blocking, and you'll see what I mean in a minute. I mean, everybody should know by now what guide coat is, where I use the actual sanding primer with a little bit of tint in it as a guide coat. Other people may use some kind of aerosol can or something like that, and I don't really like the way those products work. It's not really for that. It looks like guide coat, but it's really not. If anything, you'd be better off using a dry guide coat in a powder form before you do your sanding. When you put aerosol lacquer guide coat, you start sanding and all it does is gum up your paper because it really doesn't dry, where this method that I'm using, it dries. So when you sand it, you're digging right into it. You're not skimming the crap off the top. But all in all, I got the 3 coats of sanding primer on them, and you look at these and you think, oh, they look good. Just sand them and you're good. Until you do this and you got washboards. And this is the difference between paint jobs and restorations. I could very easily just get a sander, sand these down till they're smooth, and paint them. And you'd probably get motion sickness looking at them. So I'm going to show you the first step in getting these to look the way they're supposed to look for a restoration. And that is with, well, these are, anybody can do this. I did it. And I made my own sanding blocks. These narrower sanding blocks that I made are good for panels of this size as opposed to the standard size. I feel that these do a better cut. It's a more thorough cut. Got a short one and a standard length block. But I'm going to show you what it looks like when you start blocking with a straight block over a panel that looks like a washboard or feels like a washboard. Okay, let's take a closer look now. As you can see, we have the nice washboard. And here again, you could try by sanding all this, just sanding it lightly, putting more primer down, and doing the step I just did over again. You could also really take up a lot of time and try and you know, spoon this stuff out, which at the end of the day, you're still gonna end up doing some body work, doing this step. I mean, I could assume that maybe this could be completely straightened out with slappers and hammers and so on and so forth, and I'd probably have as much time trying to straighten this that way as I did doing all the steps I'm doing here on all these panels. I mean, I've seen it done where guys spend days and days and days and days just trying to straighten out something like this to just to say that, oh, they have no filler on their panel. Well, that's just great. But in the real world and from an economic standpoint, I can have these done today and in primer, as opposed to sitting here for hours and hours and hours, hammer and dolling all this stuff and then having to reprime it anyway. And again, there's a chance that I'm gonna be putting plastic on it. But you can see where I've hit burn through some spots. Like here I didn't quite hit metal, I just got into the epoxy. Here I really hit metal. So we got a good low spot, and this is pretty common with the tops of these fenders of a car that's 30, 40, 50 years old. I thank all the mechanics that worked on this car for all of this damage. I have pretty pointy elbows, and I'm sure there's a lot of other mechanics just like me that also do too. So keep your elbows off the tops of freshly painted fenders, guys. Bodymen do appreciate it. But anyway, now I'm gonna go ahead, because I mean, here again, it's basically the whole panel that's one big wave, one big washboard. So I'm gonna go ahead and I'm gonna sand all this quickly with a sander to get some scratches in all of it. And then I'm gonna go and I'm gonna take the next step of putting plastic on it. But there's a few steps we're gonna talk about before I do that. So before I put some plastic on here, I want to put some tape on the areas that I don't want to make a mess. Like inside here, you have a tendency to, you know, maybe slop some plastic into here, and it's easier to put tape on it and pull the tape on, or pull the tape off, than it is to have to go back and sand those little spots. It's not a big deal, but it's just something. It takes a couple seconds to put tape on it, a couple seconds to pull it off. It saves a little bit more time than having to try and clean all that plastic off. The other thing is this top little ledge here on each edge of the fender, they're okay. This one's a little wonky, but not to the point where it needs filler. So I'm gonna make a line here to then put a piece of tape down to keep the plastic just in the area that I wanna have it on. I don't wanna be, I wanna maintain this line as best I can. And I made this little trick where you grind half of a pencil off, and then you can lay it across a ledge and it'll give you a line. It's not a machine shop grade line, but it's enough to tell the story about where the 3/4 inch tape has to go. Again, as seen in other videos, I laid 2 layers down. One layer to stay, and the top layer will be pulled off after I coat each panel, maintaining my nice straight line. So the next thing is mixing plastic to put on the panels. So here I have some body filler with some activator on it. I got my mud spreader, and I got a wooden mixing stick. One thing is this amount of plastic is 200 grams of filler at 2% hardener, which would be 4 grams of cream hardener. I mix this on a scale. I suggest anybody starting out use a scale to learn by sight about how much hardener you need depending on the batch of filler you're going to use. The single straight line method across the pancake kind of works, but depending on how thick that pancake is laying on the board is going to change that percentage. Again, that comes with time, that you can do it off the cuff. I've been doing this a long time. I have a scale. I'm going to use the scale because the other thing it guarantees is that I'm mixing the plastic correctly, because putting too much hardener in it to make it kick off faster, or putting too little hardener in it so that you can work it and work it and work it, blah, blah, blah. Again, you can have long-term effects, problems, not mixing the products correctly. So that's my suggestion just on your filler and filler to hardener. Now when it comes to the next step is we're gonna stir this up. Don't use your spreader. Or if you're gonna use your spreader, use another spreader to then do the work, because till you're done mixing this, if you make a mess with this, you're just gonna make a mess on the panel. Plus, I think it's more thorough to mix with a stick and really get this agitated before you want to put it on the panel. So here we go. Now putting it on the panel, try not to slop it on. Don't lay it on either. You kind of gotta press it in, you know, apply a little bit of pressure. I did forget to tape my flanges like I said I was going to, but I think I'll be okay. When you're putting filler on, you want to put it on as evenly and smoothly as possible. If you slop it on, it's just going to be that much more work when it comes to sanding. And now I'm putting the filler on over the entire panel, over the high spots, essentially over the low spots, to then bring this layer with the sanding block down evenly back down to the parent metal or the parent primer. You don't necessarily want to be, you don't want to sand further than where you've actually started from. If you start with panels that look like this and you end with panels that are almost bare metal, then you're doing it completely incorrectly. And that's usually because you're using the wrong tool. A straight sanding block will never allow you, I've got a chunk in there, will never allow you to go further than what you need to go. If you're hitting a metal spot on one side and hitting a metal spot on the other side, and you still have a low spot in the middle, you don't keep sanding on the low spot because it hasn't been sanded. You have to add more filler to that. But the metal spots that you've hit tell you you can't go any lower. And you're not going to sand the metal down. The metal is going to stay at the same height. The sandpaper will wear out before the metal goes away. So don't keep sanding. When you start hitting metal, when you start seeing the shadow of metal coming through on anything, I can tell I'm at the bottom of my filler can because I got a lot of garbage in it, a lot of chunks. But that's okay, this is just the first coat. So I got a little bit more here. Gonna start this panel going down this side. Now, as I said, I mixed 200 grams to 4 grams of activator. The more you mix at once, the more activator you need. So once you've mixed it on the board and it's sitting there, it's activating. Once you put the activator on it, you start stirring it, it's activating. So if you make a huge board, maybe 300-400 grams, and put the necessary activator in it, the correct amount of activator in it, more than likely the body filler is going to be kicked off before you're able to spread it. Like this is just starting to, like you can see now, it's starting to harden up a little bit. Well, if I scrape this off here and try to squeeze it onto this panel, it may stick, but the properties making it stick to the panel are gone. And it isn't worth the risk. Again, it may be good today, it may be good tomorrow, but once these panels get out into the sunlight, if that adhesion isn't correct, stuff's gonna happen and you're gonna be repainting panels. You're gonna be redoing this bodywork because it didn't stick. So kind of know your limits, do a little at a time rather than, if you have a big area to do, again, they make bigger mud spreaders, they make bigger boards, but the bigger the mud spreader and the bigger the batch of mud, the faster you're gonna have to go, the more of a mess you're gonna make. You're gonna lay it down thick and inconsistent, and it's just gonna make more work. So to me, and again, with these clean sheet boards, which I never really got into early on, but now see that this is, I got a little bit to go yet. So just tear a page off and I got a clean board. Same with Bondo spreaders. I use a little cup of lacquer thinner and a paintbrush and my mixing stick. I scrape it clean. Don't use a razor blade, don't use sandpaper, and you can use mud spreaders over and over and over and over again 100,000 times. Some people think these are for one-time use. I'd never understood that idea. Clean up your mud spreader, you got a clean board, mix up a little more plastic, and you know, now it's time to let it flash. So I'm gonna mix up a little bit more, and I'm gonna finish this off, and then we're gonna start sanding. I'm gonna hit this first coat here with 80 grit, and 80 is a good place to start. You could start with a 36 or a 40, especially if you're gonna do multiple coats that you're gonna be refilling those heavy scratches. But this is a pretty even fine coat. 80 grit should do the job. And cut it pretty nicely. If you start sanding and you have a lot of residue sticking to the paper, then you got to let it sit a little bit more. And now that I've been feeling this more and more and more, it's still a little bit sticky on the top. So I'm going to give this a few more minutes and then I'm going to start sanding. So I'll give this a few minutes to cure and then I'll get back to it. So that's the first coat sanded. Overall, I mean, you can see some spots where I've cut back down to what I always say, cut it down to the ground floor, back down to the metal. So these, you can see, I got some high spots. I've hit metal along the edge on each fender at different points. Again, because of the gradual waviness. There are still some substantial lows. There's a good couple low spots here and here. Again, what I'll do now is anywhere where there's obvious lows, I'll just concentrate and put some plastic in those areas. By itself, let those, dry and flash, and knock those down, get them down to, or get them to the level of where we are here. Then, more than likely, I'll take one more last skim coat and skim coat the entire fender. Again, now that the smoother the panel becomes, bodywork wise, and the less inconsistencies in the panel, the smoother you're going to see the filler lay down. You're going to be smearing it, and you're only going to be filling in very gradual imperfections. Whereas when it's high and low, you can't really spread it as evenly. You want to spread it thin all the time, relatively thin. You're always going to have a little bit of build, but you don't want to just kind of glob it on there. The thicker you put it on, the more chance you're going to have like cavities and pinholes and things like that. So you want to do it thin, but the smoother you get it, as in the more, the second coat and the third coat per se, every time you recoat it, it's going to be going on a lot smoother because you're going on a smoother surface. So get these low spots filled in, get them sanded, and once I do that, again, I'll do a whole nother skim coat, knock that down, knock it down starting with 80, and then once I feel like I'm close, that it's all consistently sanded, I'll go back to 120, and I'll just kind of knock the 80 scratches down, again, making it smoother so that when I put my primer down, the surface is a little bit smoother and the primer will flow out that much better, and you'll have not as many real deep aggressive scratches. So let's keep moving on. Well, all the rough plastic work is done. In total, I did my first full coat or partial full coat across the primer. I sanded that. I filled in some low spots, sanded that, and then I did one final full skim, which left me with one little spot here and one little spot on another fender that I totally missed. So all in all, wasn't too terrible. Sanded it all with 80 grit. Once everything was relatively even, come back after it with 120, and after you've sanded it with 80, it's relatively straight, but when you follow the 80 grit with the 120 without adding anything, you cut it a little bit more fine. You can then even feel, it's obviously smoother, so you can feel the panel that much better, which tells you if the work is done right. And using any kind of rigid straight blocks on a long straight run like this, you're almost guaranteed all the time to get a straight cut, a straight result. But that 120 after the 80 just gives it that extra little something that just, you can tell how straight it actually is by how smooth it is and how even it feels. So bodywork here is done. What's left to do now is get these fenders covered up, bagged up. The insides of the fenders have already been painted black, so I have to cover those up. And what I need to do next is get 3 coats of sanding primer on these. What I'm going to do is, as I've said in previous videos, the first 3 coats I like to reduce, make the primer thinner, wetter, and what it's going to do is it's going to have a better tendency to get into any of these little scratches, as opposed to if it was thicker. What can happen is it'll actually bridge the scratches. So I like to make the primer wetter. Plus, when it's this smooth and it's wet, as I've said in earlier videos, it flows out much nicer. So I'll put these 3 coats on, come back in tomorrow. I'll rip over all these with probably 220, and I'll prime them again. And these panels will be good as ready for paint, to be prepped for paint, I should say. So I'll get these bagged up and get them in the primer. All right, all our panels are primed. 3 nice reduced wet coats of primer. Not a huge amount of build, but enough to fill a lot of scratches. As you can see right here, like you can see the primer in the scratches. It's because it's in there nice. The nice reduced primer will flow into all those little pores and imperfections better than if it was just mixed standard 4:1, where it's a lot thicker. It may give you more build, but it may also bridge over those kind of scratches. So here I started sanding with 120 grit with my long block here, and I did burn through a little bit, but again, this layer of primer isn't very thick. This is in substitution of doing like a glaze coat. First of all, it would take a ton of glaze to be able to glaze all this plastic work. When you spread glaze It's hard to spread it evenly. Spraying primer over a big area like this is much easier, lays down smoother. It's going to be much easier to sand. You're going to find some imperfections. There's some little pinholes and stuff up here. There's a little divot right there, one down here. All those little areas, after I'm done sanding all this, I can go back. They stick out like a sore thumb. I can put a little glaze on those little spots to correct them, and then I can go ahead and put 3 more nice wet coats of primer on the panel. Once that's done, all the panels will get fit back on the car. One thing I'll concentrate on is getting the body lines absolutely correct before paint. That's the first thing I'll do after I get the alignments done. And then I can finish the panels however I would like, but I can, you know, whether I do them on the car or I take them off, but getting the body line, the quarter, the door, and the fender in line is the most important thing. And having them on the car is the best way to do it without error. So this area, like I said, is I cut this with 120, and I haven't hit any metal yet. Just showing primer. I'm just showing a little bit of filler. So I'm still safe. This area is going to be perfect. This is how it started to look when I first started sanding it, and all of that pretty much came out over here, whether in the primer or back down into the filler. And again, because I'm back down to the filler, this primer coat hasn't really added a ton of millage to the overall panel and the overall work. So the final 3 coats, again, I'll do them wet because, again, since this is going to be nice and smooth and all the flaws are going to be out of it, that nice wet coat is going to lay down really, really nice. I'll be able to come back and hit that with like 320 to get that ready for sealer and base coat. And there should be, you know, you should end up with a nice, even, sanded coat of primer, no burn throughs, no low spots, nothing. It'll be absolutely ready to put a sealer coat on. So that's where that's at. And I'm going to go ahead and keep on sanding. So once again, thanks for tuning in to DTR's YouTube channel. If you like this video, give it a thumbs up. I would really appreciate it. If you want to see more videos, you can always subscribe to the channel. If you have any questions or comments, feel free to leave them in the comments below. All the details of DTR are also in the description below on how to contact us. So with that being said, thanks again for watching, and see you next time.